Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever had an idea that just wouldn't let you go? For John Henry Newman, that idea was the church. In Pablo Blanco Sardo's essay, he uses this absolutely beautiful metaphor. He says Newman's thought was like a symphony. The church was his ultimate leitmotif, a lifelong obsession. It started out as this quiet, almost background murmur in his mind, and then, slowly but surely, built up into this massive, life-altering climax. It's a pretty epic intellectual journey, honestly.
So, welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to unpack Sarto's fascinating analysis. I want you to think of this as kind of an intellectual detective story. We're going to track the clues in Newman's mind to figure out exactly how and why his views on the church changed so radically during the 19th century. It's going to be a really captivating ride, for sure.
Here's our roadmap for the journey. First, we'll look at that musical leitmotif idea. Then we'll tackle the tension he felt between the visible and invisible church. After that, we'll hit the apostolic heritage, followed by his absolute breaking point, the crisis of the via media. Finally, we'll wrap up with his ultimate vision, the call to holiness. Let's get right to it.
Starting with Section 1, Newman's Leitmotif, a symphony in 3 movements.
According to the essay, Newman's evolving theology on the church breaks down perfectly into 3 musical movements. First, in his youth, it was an adagio, just soft background music. Funny enough, early on, he was actually super suspicious of any earthly institution. But then, it shifted to an andante. It became his absolute central focus during his debates at Oxford. And finally, boom, it exploded into an allegro, a passionate, dramatic defense of the church. I mean, he went from being a total skeptic of institutional rules to their biggest defender. Talk about a complete 180.
And that massive shift brings us to Section 2, the visible and the invisible, the 2 faces of the church. Newman was wrestling with this really tricky paradox. Like, how on earth can a purely spiritual, heavenly entity also be an earthly institution run by flawed humans? On one hand, you've got the visible church, the physical sacraments, the hierarchy, what he called the universal sacrament of salvation. But then on the other hand, you have the invisible church, this hidden mystical communion of saints united directly with the Trinity. So do these 2 things just clash? Do they cancel each other out? And this brilliantly illustrates Newman's answer to that paradox. He used this beautifully simple geometric analogy, concave and convex. He argued that they aren't 2 separate churches fighting for dominance. Nope, they are literally just 2 sides of the exact same reality. What looks purely physical and institutional from the outside is, on the inside, purely spiritual and heavenly. It's just an incredibly elegant way of showing how both natures can exist together perfectly without contradiction.
Now that we understand that double nature, let's move to Section 3, Apostolic Heritage and the Pillars of Faith.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how concrete Newman gets. Drawing from an 1826 sermon, he laid out 4 unbreakable pillars for this visible institution. He wasn't talking about abstract theories here, he meant hard, historical facts. We're talking a real origin at the Last Supper, a physical line of governance passed down to the laying on of hands over centuries, clear spiritual laws, and a systematic governance to protect its purity. For Newman, the church wasn't just some voluntary social club, it was an absolutely indispensable historical and sacramental framework. But wait, here is where Newman throws us a really fascinating curveball. Even within this massive hierarchy of bishops, he gave a crucial, fundamental role to, well, everyday people, the laity. He heavily promoted this concept of sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful. He essentially argued that the priests are there to serve the flock, not the other way around, which, was a pretty radical modern perspective for his time.
And to back this up, he pointed straight to history. Look at the massive Arian crisis in the 4th century. The church was practically splitting in half over the very nature of Christ. And who preserved the true Catholic faith during all that chaos? It wasn't the bishops or the high-ranking hierarchy. Actually, no. It was the everyday believers. The people in the pews kept the historical truth alive, even when their own leaders were totally failing them. It's a really powerful historical reminder.
And honestly, it's that exact relentless scrutiny of history that brings us to the climax of his intellectual arc. Section 4, the crisis of the via media and his absolute breaking point.
So, what on earth was the via media? Well, this was Newman's grand life project during his Oxford years. He wanted to prove that the Church of England was this perfect middle way, a flawless bridge between what he saw as the corruptions of Rome and the extremes of Protestantism. On paper,
It was mathematically, architecturally perfect. So the crucial point is, reality rarely cooperates with perfectly balanced theories.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the drama escalates incredibly fast. In 1833, he starts defending the visible church. By 1834, he's formulating his exquisite Via Media. But then, 1841 happens, and the whole thing just collapses. He publishes his famous Tract 90, trying to reconcile Anglican doctrines with ancient history, and it sets off an absolute social catastrophe. Bishops, academics, the press, they overwhelmingly condemned it. His delicate intellectual house of cards just exploded.
This harsh reality check led him to a really heavy, dramatic realization. He wrote, "There are but two alternatives, the way to Rome and the way to atheism." For Newman's brilliant mind, the Via Media turned out to be an impossible mathematical illusion. When he dug deep enough, he found that middle ground literally didn't exist. This total collapse of his worldview is what finally pushed him into his famous and really painful conversion to Catholicism.
Which brings us to our final stop. How did he resolve this massive theological storm? Section 5. A Call to Holiness, the Final Purpose.
It is super important to note that after his conversion to Catholicism in 1845, Newman didn't look back with bitterness. Not at all. He actually continued to deeply respect the Anglican Church. He affectionately called it a venerable institution, acknowledging that it fostered invaluable human virtues, even if he'd concluded it lacked divine origin.
But Newman wasn't naive about his new home either. He fully knew the Catholic Church was full of humans who make mistakes. To explain this, he used a brilliant metaphor. Sinful members are like a dead branch on a living plant. Just because there's a dead branch doesn't mean the whole tree is corrupt or dead, right? The roots and the sap, representing the spirit, are still completely alive and healthy.
And understanding that human imperfection leads us to this really beautiful final concept. Newman believed the church should essentially be seen as a medical dispensary. Long before we use terms like field hospital, he was arguing that the institution doesn't exist to be some elite club for flawless people. It exists precisely because people are sick. They need a place equipped with the ordinary means of grace to heal them and call them toward holiness.
I want to wrap up our explainer today with the haunting, deeply personal question that ultimately pushed Newman to take his leap of faith. Can I be saved in the Church of England? If I died tonight, would I be safe? Beyond all the intense theological mazes and historical debates, this is really the story of a brilliant mind forced by his own conscience to seek the truth, no matter the personal cost. So it leaves us with an unavoidable question. How far would we be willing to go for our own convictions? It's been an absolute pleasure exploring this monumental intellectual journey with you.